Our relationships change the course of our lives, but can they change history? I'm the Affair Archivist, and in this video we'll be delving into the Gothic romance between Mary Godwin Shelley and Percy Bysshe Shelley. In the spring of 1814, Mary Godwin had just returned to London from a trip to Scotland in which her ideas about love and life were forever changed. The 16-year-old was determined to live a radical life of adventure, as her mother had, but it seemed that she had very little options. Her father did not have the money to arrange an advantageous marriage for her, and despite her intelligence and drive, her only career options were governess or teacher. On one fateful April evening, Mary's father, William Godwin, invited the 21-year-old Percy Bysshe Shelley to dinner. The young poet admired Godwin, who was a respected and radical writer and philosopher. Cynically, Godwin extended the invite to Shelley so he could ask him for a loan. He was on the brink of financial ruin and was desperate to avoid debtor's prison. Shelley was third in line to be a baronet behind his father and grandfather, but did not have much money to give. He was estranged from his family due to his radical political and religious views. A few days before the dinner, Shelley wrote of a premonition he had in which he would meet the female who is destined to be mine. Though Shelley had been to dinner at the Godwins' home before, inspiring crushes in Mary's sisters, when Mary opened the door to greet him, he fell in love at first sight, enamored with her soul, which he said was burning like a lamp of vestal fire. She was similarly infatuated and barely spoke all evening. When she did engage in discussion, it was clear that she was sharp and well-educated, like her late mother, Mary Wollstonecraft. He was determined to make her his muse. However, Mary and Percy's romance would be complicated by countless factors, most urgently the fact that he was already married. In the pursuit of their love, they became social outcasts in their time, but would be remembered to history as revolutionaries in both life and literature. Their tragic romance was just as Gothic as some of the iconic stories and poems they penned. The circumstances of Mary Godwin Shelley's birth would haunt her for the rest of her life. She was born on August 30th, 1797, and was considered too frail to survive infancy. Her mother, writer Mary Wollstonecraft, died of childbed fever 10 days later. Wollstonecraft was a trailblazer and most famous for her essay, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which advocated for female autonomy and criticized the institution of marriage, radical propositions for the time period. Throughout her life, Mary yearned to meet her mother. She spent a significant amount of time visiting her grave and reading her work to feel close to her. Mary had one older sister, Fanny, who was 3 years old and born out of wedlock from one of Wollstonecraft's previous relationships. Godwin was married to Wollstonecraft, and after her death, took responsibility for raising both of her girls, but often struggled to play the role of both mother and father, especially when it came to being affectionate. In 1801, Godwin remarried Mary Jane Clairmont, who had 2 small children who were also believed to be illegitimate. This changed Mary's life significantly. Before, she was used to just living with her father and half-sister, and did not have much strife in her home life. However, she and Mary Jane butted heads instantly, and would continue to do so throughout her girlhood. Godwin's new wife believed that the man had spoiled his daughter and intended to undo these indulgences. Mary Jane focused most of her attention on Mary and ignored the reserved Fanny. Mary also felt she was in competition with Mary Jane's daughter, Jane. They were close in age, but did not always get along. Mary relished in her father's attention. He spent extra time reading and discussing philosophy and politics with her. He had high standards and was often critical of her, but this pushed Mary to work harder to gain his approval. Jane was resentful of Mary's relationship with her father. Mary feared that Jane would try to take her place as Godwin's favorite. Household tensions led to Mary developing eczema. In her teen years, Mary was sent to Scotland periodically to get away from the turmoil at home. She lived with William Baxter, an admirer of her father's writings, and was inspired by the beauty and freedom of the country. Despite these respites, Mary came home and continued to fight with her stepmother. Upon her return from her second trip to Scotland in 1814, she met Percy Bysshe Shelley at her father's home in London. The two were immediately smitten with each other, and shared a love of literature and a desire to cast away the conventions of their time. Shelley was a staunch admirer of both her mother and father's work, and saw Mary as an opportunity for inspiration. Shelley was a member of the aristocracy, but in no way conformed to the traditions and expectations he was born into. From an early age, it was clear that he was as charismatic and dynamic as he was rebellious. Shelley was born in 1792 and was the oldest of 7 children, which made him the eventual heir to his grandfather's title. Shelley delighted in playing pranks on his younger sisters and telling them terrifying ghost stories. When his father punished him, he cut down trees on their land in retaliation. As a young man, he was expelled from Oxford for anonymously writing and publishing a pamphlet that advocated atheism. When he was caught, he was unrepentant and kicked out of the institution. Though he was born to wealth and prestige, this disgrace drove a wedge between himself and his father and grandfather. The 2 elder men got their retribution by withholding funds from Shelley. He didn't help matters much when he eloped with Harriet Westbrook, the 16-year-old daughter of a tavern owner, in 1811. Shelley, who was not exactly fiscally responsible, was nearly cut off. He resorted to taking out post-death loans, which he would have to pay 4 times the interest on after his father and grandfather passed, and he became baronet. Shelley wrote novels and poetry and advocated for the freedom of Ireland from British rule. He and Harriet separated for a time, and he felt he had rushed into the union. He realized he did not quite believe in the institution of marriage anyway, views that were inspired in large part by Wollstonecraft's writings. Still, they eventually reunited, and Harriet gave birth to their daughter, Ianthe, in 1813. As a new mother, Harriet yearned to live a more stable lifestyle, which flew in the face of everything Percy stood for. He then believed his marriage was a rash and heartless union, and that he felt as if a dead and living body had been linked together in some loathsome and horrible communion. He was in this frame of mind when he went to William Godwin's home for dinner in April of 1814 and met Mary. Mary was of course disappointed that Percy was married, but she could tell he was unhappy, and that gave her hope. They began seeing each other. Percy visited as she worked at the family's bookstore. They walked together in the gardens of London, and he was a frequent dinner guest at the Godwin home. Mary knew she was playing with fire. Dating a married man in this time period was enough to ruin a young woman's reputation. However, Mary was emboldened by her mother's rebellious spirit and was assured that her father would support her relationship with Shelley once it was out in the open. After all, Godwin had married her mother, who had a child out of wedlock and was considered a pariah in society. Mary and Percy also frequently met in front of Mary Wollstonecraft's tombstone. They read her essays and books and had conversations about their families, philosophy, and love. Word was beginning to get out that Mary and Percy were seeing each other. Despite the fact that gossip was beginning to spread and that Shelley was coming over for dinner nearly every night, Godwin and Mary Jane were none the wiser to the love affair. Mary's stepsister and frenemy, Jane, acted as the go-between, despite having a crush on Percy and being once again jealous of her sister. On June 27, 1814, Mary professed her undying love for Percy and threw herself in his arms. Percy recalled that Mary was possessed by a spirit that sees into the truth of things. The sublime and rapturous moment when she confessed herself mine, who had so long been hers in secret, cannot be painted to mortal imaginations. Mary wrote that they laid on the grass by her mother's grave and touched each other with the full ardor of love. Many have interpreted this to mean that Mary and Percy had sex on top of her mother's grave. Although we cannot know for sure if the act transpired in this particular setting, it is clear that their physical relationship commenced around this time. This was no risk at all for Percy. He was a man and would not suffer any consequences for having extramarital affairs. Additionally, he was already considered ruined in polite society. For Mary, the consequences of an affair with a married man and having sex before marriage were dire, but she didn't care. She loved Percy, and she was going to be with him no matter what. Not only was Percy married, but Harriet was expecting another child. He assured Mary that the baby was likely not his, and that she had been unfaithful to him. This was not true. However, the definition of the word unfaithful may have been more abstract to Shelley. He felt Harriet betrayed him by asking him to be a normal husband and father, after he made it clear that he was not capable of taking on either role. In his mind, staying in a marriage after the decay of their affection would be a most intolerable cruelty. When Harriet learned of the affair, she obviously did not take the news well and believed that Mary had schemed to seduce Percy. She is to blame. She heated his imagination by talking of her mother and going to her grave with him every day, till at last she told him she was dying of love for him. By July, Mary decided to tell her father the truth about her relationship with Percy. She was fully confident that her father would support the relationship. To her shock, Godwin was horrified and confined her to the schoolroom in their home. He forbade Percy from ever entering his house again. Still, Mary managed to communicate with Percy through letters, which were delivered by Jane. Distraught over his lover's imprisonment, Shelley took an overdose of laudanum, which he survived. During her confinement, Mary soothed herself by reading Shelley's poems and letters over and over again. Still, Shelley's rebellious nature, or perhaps in modern terms, his oppositional defiance disorder, inspired him not to give up on his love for Mary. Shelley hatched a plan to break Mary out of her father's house and run away with her. He paid off a servant to deliver the letter, as Jane had been caught being the go-between. Mary was torn when she received the letter. She loved Percy and did not care about her reputation in the slightest. However, she knew if she ran away with him, it may forever damage her relationship with her father. She dreaded disappointing Godwin. Still, she chose Percy, and she and Jane planned to run off to France with him on July 28th at 4 a.m. The evening before their great escape, during dinner, Mary and Jane acted as if everything was perfectly normal. When the time finally came to meet Shelley, Mary hesitated. She ran back into her house from their getaway carriage and wrote a letter of apology to her father, imploring him to understand her reasons for running away with Shelley. She felt awful about the pain this would inflict on him. Still, she joined Jane and Percy on a long and arduous journey to France. They decided to relocate there because Mary's mother had lived there during the Revolution, and they hoped to find the same ideals and liberal mindset in Paris. Mary was frequently sick while traveling. Percy worried they would be caught, and Jane was exhilarated by their great escape. When they reached Dover, Shelley paid a fisherman to get them across the channel. On the voyage, a storm hit. They held on to the boat for their lives. Mary and Jane feared death. Shelley thought the storm was romantic, in true Gothic poet fashion. Finally, Shelley said, "Mary, look, the sun rises over France." They had arrived in Calais. Mary believed this to be an auspicious sign for their new life. They settled into Dessins, a luxurious hotel that was popular among rich English people. They were desperate for rest and slept for hours until a knock on the door was heard. One of the workers told them a fat lady was at the hotel demanding to get her daughter back. It was Mary Jane. Jane almost relented and surrendered herself to her mother, but Shelley talked her out of it, insisting that they had to commit to living their life of passion and freedom. Mary Jane eventually left and conceded defeat to Mary, who she blamed for corrupting her child. Word began to spread across London, as both Mary Jane and Harriet wrote about the affair. Harriet in particular made some very damaging accusations. Though Percy admitted he was in love with Mary, she assumed he would come back to her as the birth of their second child drew closer. When that did not happen, she disparaged Mary and her family. She claimed that Godwin had sold Mary to Shelley for £1,500, which was made an even more damning charge when it turned out that Shelley did lend Godwin some money the night before he ran off with Mary. Many in London society believed Percy was in a physical relationship with Mary and Jane, and that Godwin had sold both girls to Shelley. Sir Timothy Shelley, Percy's father, called Mary a whore and was enraged at his son. Shelley was fine with pissing off his father, but Mary still harbored feelings of guilt and a desire for her father's approval. By August, they had arrived in Paris, but were disappointed to learn that the revolutionary spirit that had drawn them to the city had mostly dissipated. By that point, Napoleon had been defeated, and the ideals of the French Revolution were fading. Still, Mary and Shelley had what they referred to as their bridal night, as they finally had a hotel room for just the two of them. They were free to express their love for each other without anxiety of getting caught. The following morning, reality hit. They were out of money. Shelley went to the bank and was able to secure a $60 loan using his aristocratic name. They decided to leave Paris. The heat was stifling, and they were disappointed with the mood in the city. Their trip through the French countryside was a mess. Throughout their journey, they endured heat, exhaustion, and were burdened by their luggage, which included numerous heavy books. Percy twisted his ankle and could barely walk. The French countryside was previously ravaged by the Russians after Napoleon's failed invasion. They slept in barns and were served spoiled milk. Instead of staying in France, they ventured to Switzerland. Percy was once again under the delusion that their lifestyle would be more accepted there. Percy dreamed of forming his own utopian society, which sounds more like a cult through a modern lens, and even wrote to his estranged wife, inviting her to join them. Mary was no longer caught up in the fantasy of free love, however. She was miserable and exhausted from the journey and thought often of her father. She realized that Shelley was not the resolution to all of her life's problems. When she expressed a small indication of these feelings, Shelley was angry at her. They argued, and she claimed she did not regret running off with him. Jane, who harbored unrequited feelings for Percy, wrote in her diary that she believed Mary wished she could turn back time. Unsurprisingly, the Swiss did not meet the trio's criteria for a forward-thinking, anti-bourgeois culture. Jane wrote that they were rich, contented, and happy, and uninteresting, for they are the most immoderately stupid and ugly, almost to deformity. The trio decided to return to England. They traveled up the Rhine and across the Channel from Holland to get there, because they did not want to return to France. They made a brief stop at a town called Gersheim, where Mary and Shelley walked along the countryside and saw a castle. Locals told them a legend that an alchemist once occupied the castle and had conducted numerous experiments to revive the dead by robbing graves. The castle was called Burg Frankenstein. By September of 1814, they were back in England and Mary was pregnant. Percy was so broke that he could not pay for the passage home and had to go to the bank to pay the captain of the ship as soon as they docked in London. However, his account was drained by Harriet in his absence. He wanted to confront her and demand his money back, but Mary was eager to avoid conflict and convinced him not to. Instead, Shelley asked some of his wealthy friends for help, but none would even receive him or Mary in their homes. Mary was a pariah in the city. She had tried reaching out to her father, but he refused to speak to her. Percy wrote to him to inform him of how much this hurt Mary. He responded that he wanted nothing to do with her and encouraged the rest of the family and her friends to disown her as well. Shelley was all Mary had, and she wished him to be her father, lover, and friend. As her pregnancy progressed, Mary was bedbound, leading to Jane and Shelley spending more time together. It was just the three of them, since nobody in the vast city of London would talk to them. This made her feel insecure. During Harriet's first pregnancy, he had an affair with a school teacher and got her pregnant, which ruined the young woman's life. Mary worried he would betray her in the same way. Around this time, Jane changed her name to Claire to distance herself from her mother. Claire and Shelley often disappeared, and many historians believe they had an affair during Mary's first pregnancy. We will never know the truth, but a compelling clue rests in the torn-out pages of both Claire and Mary's diaries, which perhaps recorded the drama of this time in their lives. Harriet gave birth to a son in November, and Percy was happy to have an heir. This annoyed Mary. To placate and distract his wife, Shelley tried to get his friend Thomas Hogg to have an affair with her. While she admired Hogg, she only loved Percy, and unlike him, did not believe in free love. She only tried to seem open to the idea to make him happy. She told Hogg what she felt for her husband. "I love him so tenderly and entirely, My life hangs on the beam of his eye, and my whole soul is entirely wrapped up in him. Despite this, she agreed to have an affair with Hogg after the birth of her child. Tragically, Mary gave birth 2 months early in February of 1815. Her daughter only lived 13 days. She was devastated by the loss and by Shelley's absence in her time of grief. She blamed herself for her daughter's death. That April, things seemed to be turning around. She and Shelley reconnected on a trip to Salt Hill, and Sir Timothy had agreed to settle Percy's debts and give him an annual income of £1,000. When they returned from their trip, tensions between Mary and Claire reached a boiling point. The latter woman was angry and believed that Percy had used her. Interestingly, she moved to a cottage in Devon that Percy rented for her shortly after she and Mary came to blows. Some historians believe that perhaps Claire was pregnant with Shelley's child. She was going away for the duration of her pregnancy to keep it a secret. Mary may have given Percy an ultimatum. It was either her or Claire, and it seemed Mary won. Still, she would always be worried that Percy might leave her one day. Without Claire in the picture, things were going smoothly for the Shelleys. Mary was pregnant again. They purchased a mansion in the countryside and had a cook and servants. Mary devoted much of her time to writing and studying, and her health improved. She and Percy's bond strengthened. Shelley also worked on his poetry. In January of 1816, Mary gave birth to a baby boy, William, who she named after her father. He still refused to speak to her, but audaciously asked Shelley for money. Shelley continued defending Mary to Godwin. That March, Claire came to live with the Shelleys yet again. While tensions between her and Mary had not entirely disappeared, they had come to a fragile peace. Claire was distracted from earning the affections of Shelley by Lord Byron. The aristocrat and poet was famous throughout Europe for his writing and his debaucherous lifestyle. At first, Claire insisted that Mary and Byron have an affair. Though she respected his work, Mary was not interested. Claire soon became infatuated with Byron. He was happy to hook up with her while in London, but soon traveled to Switzerland and hinted that he did not want Claire to come with him. Ignoring the hint, she convinced Mary and Shelley to accompany her to Geneva, under the guise of trying to arrange an affair between Byron and Mary, despite Mary's lack of interest. Given that the Shelleys were outcasts in London, they decided to accompany Claire to Switzerland with their 4-month-old infant. The trip, like many of their adventures, was arduous, as 1816 would be remembered as the year without summer, and the weather conditions were not ideal. Still, they made it to Geneva and began staying at a fancy hotel after Shelley lied that he and Mary were married. Soon, however, the Swiss were wise to what was actually happening, and they were forced to leave the hotel and rent a chalet. Byron and Shelley quickly became bored and challenged all of the guests at the home to write a ghost story one evening in June. Shelley and Byron told their own tales, but it would be Mary's ghost story, which it is believed that she conceived the idea of that evening, that would live on forever. The inspiration also came from a haunting dream Mary had about her late daughter, in which she revived the baby by the fire. Some have contested that Mary began writing Frankenstein for the competition, but John William Polidori, writer of Vampire, insisted that Mary did in fact begin Frankenstein that night. Polidori professed his love for Mary around this time, but she told him that she only loved Percy. As Mary labored over the first draft of Frankenstein, Shelley and Byron went sailing together and were nearly drowned in a storm. Shelley could not swim. Claire soon discovered Byron had gotten her pregnant, and the shameless raconteur refused to take responsibility or marry her. Shelley stepped up to the plate and convinced Byron to acknowledge the child and give Claire and the baby a yearly allowance. Percy, Mary, and Claire returned to England and settled in Bath, agreeing that they would claim that Claire was actually the aunt of her own child in order to avoid further disgrace. Mary felt uneasy once again. If people found out about Claire's pregnancy, they may assume that Percy fathered the child. She resented having to take care of Claire and still saw her as a threat. That autumn was gloomy and depressing, but provided the perfect backdrop for her to focus on her manuscript. Frankenstein was inspired in large part by her estrangement with her family. She understood what it was like to be one of society's rejects, and used this experience to humanize the monster. Her mother's death shortly after her birth also seemed to inspire her greatest work, as the theme of the creator being consumed by their creation and the guilt that ensues stayed with Mary until the end of her days. In the meantime, Claire was helplessly in love with Byron and wrote to him that, "I shall love you to the end of my life and nobody else." When he replied asking for money from Shelley, she was deeply upset. Mary's half-sister Fanny asked to come live with them in Bath, likely sick of life with the Godwins in London. Unfortunately, Percy declined her request, as Claire was visibly pregnant and he did not want word of her condition spreading. This turned out to be a fateful decision. Distraught, Fanny ran away to Wales and overdosed on laudanum. Mary would feel anguish and guilt for the rest of her life over what happened to Fanny, and there was still more tragedies yet to come. In December of 1816, Harriet, who was pregnant at the time, drowned in the Serpentine River in Hyde Park. She was 21 years old. In the months preceding her death, she began an affair with a man who was believed to have had military connections, which left her pregnant. She moved out of her family's home to hide her pregnancy, but still, it seems the shame and pressure of this prompted her to end her life. This instilled even more guilt and dread into Mary's heart. She felt directly responsible for Harriet's death, and feared that if Shelley left her, she might do the same. Shelley tried to get custody of his children, who he barely knew, but Harriet's family was not going to make it easy for him, as they blamed him for their daughter's death. Percy believed his chances would be improved if he and Mary were husband and wife. He asked Mary to marry him, but it was anything but romantic. He still believed that marriage was a sham, writing to Byron, "I need not inform you that this is simply with us a measure of convenience, and that our opinions to the importance of this pretended sanction, and all the prejudice connected with it, remain the same." Mary didn't care much about getting married, but also had her own motives. Perhaps her standing in society would improve, and most hopefully, her father would be willing to make amends with her. 2 days after they made it official on December 30th, 1816, Godwin agreed to see Mary. He once again asked to borrow money, and bragged about how his daughter made a good marriage. In early 1817, Mary was pregnant again, and Shelley was fighting to get custody of his children. He used Harriet's plight to make himself seem more sympathetic, highlighting how she too had had an affair out of wedlock, and after discovering she was pregnant, was abandoned by the man who had gotten her in trouble. He claimed that when she returned to her parents for help, they rejected her, which prompted her suicide. In the 6 weeks between being disowned by her parents and her death, Shelley claimed that Harriet was prostituting herself to survive. None of this theater worked to win Shelley his children, and when he planned to kidnap them, his friends thankfully talked him out of the scheme. They moved to a new mansion in Marlow, which Shelley inherited from his grandfather. A family called the Hunts agreed to raise Claire's child, a daughter named Allegra, as their own. Mary was finalizing her draft of Frankenstein and preparing to send it out to publishers. Shelley was kind to the townspeople and even took in an orphaned child for a time. Still, the villagers were skeptical of Shelley and what they believed to be his harem of women, and likely knew that Allegra was born out of wedlock. In September of that year, Mary gave birth to a daughter, Clara, who she named after Claire, despite their strained relationship. As she recovered from the birth, she noticed Shelley and Claire were getting close again, which filled her with jealousy and resentment. For a time, Shelley and Claire moved to London together, taking Allegra with them, and leaving Mary and 2 small children behind. Despite how this may have looked, Claire still desperately tried to win back the attention of Byron, writing to him about their daughter, believing that if he just met her, he would be convinced of their value and fall in love with them both. He was unmoved by Claire's pleas and stayed in Italy. Frankenstein was published to scathing reviews in January of 1818. Critics of the period saw the novel as obscene and grotesque, and did not believe that a woman was capable of writing such a horrifying tale. Frankenstein would languish in obscurity for decades, and Mary would struggle to earn the respect she deserved as a writer throughout her lifetime. Shelley also published a book of poems that same year, which also bombed. Though Mary hoped either of the books would improve their financial situation, they did not. Even worse, Shelley was in bad health. He'd been diagnosed with consumption a few years previously, but it is unlikely that he actually suffered from this ailment. However, he barely ate or got off the couch for months. In an effort to cure whatever was plaguing him, he decided they should move to Italy for warmer weather. They took the children, as well as Claire and Allegra, with them. This would be a fateful decision. Soon after they moved, Shelley wrote his most profound and lasting poem, Ozymandias, which was intended as a diss to England, likely born out of resentment from being a social outcast for years in his native land. The poem communicated the message that though the nation was rich and prosperous then, one day the English Empire would fall. The trio and their children arrived in Italy in March of 1818. Mary and Shelley vacationed at Lake Como and asked Lord Byron to stay with them. He declined, but insisted that Claire send Allegra to live with him. Claire agreed, believing her daughter would have a better life with her wealthy father, but was devastated when the time came for Allegra to go. Soon after, the Shelleys moved to Livorno, even though Mary wanted to stay where they were for the summer. After the move, Clara became sick with fever. Complicating matters further was a word about Allegra that came from her nurse. Byron's lifestyle was not compatible with fatherhood, to say the least, and the most disturbing accusation of all was that he planned to groom his little daughter to one day be his mistress. In a panic, Claire rushed to Venice, and Shelley went with her. Mary was angry to be left alone with her sick child, and to once again have Claire come in between her and Shelley. As Clara's condition worsened, Mary received a letter from Shelley begging her to come to Venice. Byron was refusing to give Allegra back to Claire, and he believed that Mary would be able to convince him. The baby had dysentery, and Mary was torn as to what to do. Ultimately, she chose to depart Livorno for Venice, as she felt she could not say no to Percy out of fear of losing him. On the journey there, Clara became even more gravely ill, slipping in and out of consciousness. When they arrived, Percy wrote Mary a love poem and insisted Clara would recover. However, that September, Clara died in her mother's arms as Mary rushed her to see a doctor. She could not forgive Percy, Claire, or herself for her daughter's death. It turned out that Mary had traveled to Venice and lost her daughter for nothing. Shelley found out that the nurse's claims about Byron were not true, and Allegra stayed with her father. They stayed in Naples for the winter. Mary barely spoke to anyone, especially Percy. She believed this was yet another tragedy that befell them because of their affair. After a long winter, the Shelleys moved to Rome, and relations between them were improving. By the spring of 1820, Mary was pregnant with their fourth child, and it seemed that better days lay ahead. Their son, and only surviving child at that point, William, was thriving in Rome, but nonetheless was a frail child. As summer approached, many advised the Shelleys to leave Rome, as malaria was a huge health risk, especially to small children. However, having just reclaimed their happiness in the Eternal City, Mary and Shelley did not want to leave. They commissioned an artist to paint a family portrait. As they sat for the piece, William showed signs of illness. His stomach was hurting, and although the doctor advised that he just had a bug, after a week he was still sick. By June, he was gravely ill, just as his sister had been the previous year. On the 7th of June, William Shelley succumbed to Rome fever, what we now know as malaria. Apart from the child she was carrying, all of Mary's 3 children had died. She once again tortured herself, going through all of the different scenarios that could have prevented her son's death. He was buried in an unmarked grave in a Protestant cemetery. They planned to place a proper tombstone over his resting place eventually, but never did. When she visited Rome years later, Mary could not find her son's final resting place. Once again, Mary shut Percy out. He too was stricken with grief, so much so that when he tried to write about his son, he could not find the words. Instead, he wrote of Mary's detachment. "My dearest Mary, wherefore hast thou gone? And left me in this dreary world alone? Thy form is here indeed, a lovely one, but thou art fled, gone down the dreary road that leads to sorrow's most obscure abode." Mary was no longer excited and hopeful for the birth of her child, just full of dread and anticipation of the day in which the child would also be taken from her. In his first letter to her after receiving word of his grandson's death, Godwin asked her for money before offering condolences. He told her, "Though at first your nearest connections may pity you in this state, yet, when they see you fixed in selfishness and ill humor, and regardless of the happiness of everyone else, they will finally cease to love you and scarcely learn to endure you." He also took the time to warn her that if she did not stop moping around over her dead children, Shelley would look to other women for excitement and pleasure. Comforting words from a father. Mary used writing as a coping mechanism. One of her poems read, "We look onto the past and stare aghast, on the ghosts with aspects strange and wild. We too yet stand in a lonely land, like tombs to mark the memory of joys and griefs that fade and flee, in the light of life's dim morning." She began to work on a new novel, one that expressed her difficult relationship with her father, her guilt about killing her mother, and her resentment towards Shelley. The novel was called Matilda. Oddly, Shelley was writing a similar story, with a protagonist inspired by his wife. This did not help to ease tensions between them. That September, they once again moved, this time to Florence. Mary continued to work on her novel, but after her father criticized it and called its content disgusting, she shelved it. It was not published until 1959. On November 12, 1819, after 2 hours of labor, Mary gave birth to her son, Percy Florence Shelley. The arrival of the baby lifted her spirits, but she still did not warm up to her husband. Claire warned her not to shut him out, but Mary was still angry with him and refused to be with him, saying she needed to recover from the birth of her child. Shelley wrote, "Mary feels no remorse in torturing me than in torturing her own mind." Soon enough, while Mary cared for the infant, Shelley was spending time with another woman, his cousin Sophia Stacy. Sophia was several years younger than him. They went to museums and parties together. She noted in her diary how Percy helped her out of her carriage and stuffed cotton in her mouth when she had a toothache. She was clearly in love with him. By the summer of 1820, however, Mary and Shelley's relationship was on the mend, and they decided to move to Pisa. Claire planned to move to Florence in September. Though he received an offer to move to the Middle East from a wealthy patron, Shelley declined, even though he was craving more excitement in his life. This prompted him to have yet another emotional affair with a younger woman named Teresa, who he renamed Amelia because he thought it sounded prettier. Amelia, née Teresa, was charmed by Shelley, and he fantasized about her. But it is unlikely that they ever had a physical relationship. She was from a politically connected family, and soon after they caught wind that she was hanging out with Shelley, they arranged a suitable marriage for her, ending all of Shelley's hopes for a love affair. Byron arrived in Pisa in the fall of 1821, and he and Shelley partied as much as possible. The English press began referring to the group as the League of Incest and Atheism. Shelley once again became entangled with a woman, this one named Jane Williams, who had left her marriage for another man named Edward and had children with him. Like the Shelleys, they were outcasts in Britain and lived in Italy to escape alienation and disgrace. Jane was less educated and opinionated than Mary, which he seemed to appreciate about her. Mary developed a crush of her own on a man named Edward John Trelawney, who had a shady past. He was married with children, but abandoned them. He claimed to have been in the Navy, told fanciful stories that always painted himself as the hero, and had an obsession with Shelley and his writing talents. Shelley was in awe of his tales of the high seas. Though charmed with him at first, Trelawney's stories became so dramatic that Mary began to suspect he was lying. In the summer of 1822, a feeling of impending doom haunted Mary. She had endured as many traumas as a person could take at that point, but felt that misfortune was not done with her. She was afraid her son would die, and that something bad would happen to the child she was currently pregnant with. As Mary wrestled with this feeling of dread, Shelley wanted to go sailing with Byron in Livorno. Mary begged them not to go, fearing that the water was dangerous, but no one listened to her. Jane and Edward Williams began spinning a yarn that Mary was a cold and unloving wife who was also trying to ruin Shelley's good time. This caused Trelawney to give her the cold shoulder. Soon after, Mary's feelings of doom were confirmed. Claire and Byron's 5-year-old daughter Allegra had died of typhus, an illness she contracted at the convent Byron sent her to. Claire blamed him, and eventually Mary and Percy, for Allegra's tragic death. Mary was devastated for Claire and tried to comfort her, and believed this was the evil premonition she had. Unfortunately, there was still more bad news to come. Shelley rented a villa in Casamani in San Terenzo, near the water. He and Mary stayed in separate rooms on opposite sides of the home. He was excited to go sailing, while Mary was depressed and afraid for her husband's life. He dismissed her fears. She wanted to go back to Pisa. He refused. She gave him the silent treatment. Mary, unfortunately, miscarried the child she was pregnant with and nearly bled to death. Percy saved her by carrying her into the bathtub and filling it with ice to stop the bleeding. Though he saved his wife's life, his mental state was deteriorating. He had dreams of drowning children, became paranoid, and started hallucinating. In one moment, he would be excited and looking forward to the future. In another, he was suicidal. One night, as he slept, he tried to strangle Mary to death. She was able to pry herself free and ran to Jane and Edward Williams's room. In between his bouts of depression and hysteria, Shelley was sailing on the bay on his new schooner, which he named Ariel. This is believed to have been in tribute to Jane, but no one knows why. Percy planned to sail to see his friend, Leigh Hunt, who was going to help him start a literary journal. Hunt was staying across the Gulf with Byron. Mary begged him not to go, and at first he listened and delayed the trip. However, a few weeks later, he set sail, promising Mary he would be home by July 8th. While she received word that he arrived safely, the 8th came and went with no sign of Percy. When she received word from Byron and Hunt that Shelley had left on that day as planned, Mary had a breakdown. She traveled to Byron's house to find her husband, but there was no sign of Percy or his schooner, and no accidents at sea had been reported. On the way back to Casamani, she visited each port for word of Percy. All she found were objects that had washed up on the shore that she believed belonged to her husband, which included a dinghy and a water bottle. As she sailed back to her home, she looked at the water and she knew. A voice within me seemed to cry aloud that this was his grave. On July 19th, Trelawney arrived at Casamani with awful news. 3 bodies had washed up on the shore. One was the body of Edward Williams. The other was a young sailor who was hired to help them across the bay. The final corpse was Percy. He was identified by a John Keats poem he had in his pocket. The men had fallen victim to a sudden squall, which had resulted in most boats turning back to the shore. Shelley's ship, which turned out to be too heavy and too poorly designed, was overpowered by the waves. He had insisted on having extra weight added to the ship so it would not list in heavy winds. This resulted in it being more susceptible to sinking. Some believed that Percy was so miserable that he intentionally ended his life. Mary tried to take the news with grace, writing to her father, "I am not, however, as desolate as you might think. He is ever with me, encouraging me to become wise and good, that I may be worthy to join him." She hoped to bury her husband alongside their son in Rome. However, the Italian authorities insisted all the bodies be cremated. Shelley's corpse was placed on a pyre that was set on fire on August 16th. Just before his body was entirely consumed by the flames, Trelawney took his heart. A year later, he was buried, and a tombstone was erected. Trelawney chose the epitaph, a quote from The Tempest. "Nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange." Mary did not attend her husband's cremation. She did, however, find new purpose in life in being a single mother, and in striving to be worthy of her husband's legacy. However, many in her life believed that her stoic reaction to Percy's death was once again a sign of coldness and uncaring, which could not have been farther from the truth. Trelawney decided to give Percy's heart to Leigh Hunt in light of Mary's strength and resilience, which he read as coldness. Jane Williams, whose partner Edward had died with Percy, continued speaking poorly of Mary behind her back. Mary still considered her a friend for several years. The rumors that Mary was cold and unloving hurt her. "No one seems to understand or sympathize with me. They seem to look on me as one without affections. I feel dejected and cowed before them, feeling as if I might be the unfeeling, senseless person they appear to consider me, but I am not." Mary stayed in Italy and worked on finishing the literary journal Shelley was working on before his death. She worried about how she would survive. Writing had never paid the bills for either of them, and without his allowance, she was unsure how she would support herself and her son. Byron helped her, suggesting she edit and publish Percy's works, and hired her to edit some of his pieces. Byron also vouched for her with Sir Timothy, who had said nothing to Mary in the wake of his son's death, in order to secure an allowance for Mary and her son. However, the baronet was not keen to offer a penny to the woman who he blamed for bringing disgrace to his family. Mary decided to return to England just as the Industrial Revolution was picking up steam. Her overlooked masterpiece, Frankenstein, was slowly finding new life on stage. However, at this time, writers did not receive residuals for productions of their works, so this did not improve her financial situation. She was also discouraged to learn that the theater versions of her story painted the monster as the villain rather than the complex and sympathetic character she had carefully crafted. Through these sloppy adaptations of the novel, Frankenstein's monster became known just as Frankenstein, a misnomer that sticks even today. Though Sir Timothy still refused to see Mary or his grandson, he agreed to give them a small allowance of £200 a year, with several lines of fine print. Mary was barred from leaving England, from talking about her husband or publishing any of his works, or from writing about him. If she found herself in debt, Sir Timothy would take custody of Percy Jr. Though she had hoped to write a biography on Shelley, she decided to take the offer as she was desperate for the money. Despite the allowance, Mary still needed the extra income from writing, and began writing for magazines. Soon after, she was able to move into her own flat with her son. Still, she wanted to be the custodian of Shelley's work and legacy, and could not help but to begin anonymously publishing collections of his poems. As she compiled his papers, she found writings that disparaged her and complimented women like Jane and Amelia. This hurt her deeply, but she decided to publish his letters as they were, despite her sadness and humiliation. When the first volume of Percy's works were published, it sold well until Sir Timothy caught on and stopped the book from being sold. Unbeknownst to him, this attempt to censor his dead son resulted in him becoming more popular than ever. Those who were able to secure copies of the book bragged about what a rare find it was, adding to Shelley's legend and mystique. By 1838, Sir Timothy allowed Mary to publish another volume of Shelley's poems, but insisted that she not reference his life or any of the numerous scandals that comprised it. She agreed, feeling that she wanted her husband to be appreciated on the merits of his literary talents only, and not smeared by the transgressions of his brief and wild life. Combing through his archives and writings brought back many painful memories for Mary. Time adds only to the keenness and vividness with which I view the past, for when tragedies and most bitter dramas were in the course of acting, I did not feel their meaning and their consequences as poignantly as I now do. In 1840, Mary went back to Italy and began experiencing headaches on the trip. She believed this to be the symptom of revisiting the setting of her most acute tragedies, the deaths of her 2 children and her husband. This may have been the case, but it was later discovered that she had a brain disease that would later lead to her decline and ultimate death about a decade later. By the time she passed away on February 1st, 1851, Mary had been living in pain for many years, but was happy that her son finally married. He and her daughter-in-law were by her side when she died. The newspapers eulogized her by mainly focusing on her marriage to Shelley, who by the Victorian era was one of Britain's most legendary romantic poets. Mary's enduring masterpiece, Frankenstein, was merely a footnote in her incredible and tragic life. However, as time went on, her legend would grow to even outshine her husband's. She was buried next to her parents in England. As Percy Jr. cleaned out his mother's desk following her passing, he found several of her personal effects: her journal, a copy of one of Shelley's poems, a tribute to John Keats, and one final thing, something given to her by Leigh Hunt, which she had held on to in secret for decades: the remains of Percy Bysshe Shelley's heart, which time had reduced to dust. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. And join me next time as we explore another affair from history.